introduce the four speakers, and I'll see why I think it's probably best to introduce them first, and then I'll say a little bit about the premises for this evening's conversation. So I have very brief introductions in alphabetical order. So I'll start with Siraj Ahmed, who is a Columbia PhD, professor of English at Lehman College here in New York. He previously chaired the comparative literature program at Mount Holyoke College. Siraj is the author of The Stillbirth of Capital, Enlightenment Writing in Colonial India, which came out in 2012. And he is working on the book project, which is what he, I think, will mostly be speaking about this evening, which is titled The Archaeology of Babel, Comparative Literature, Critical Method, and Colonial Law. Srinivas Aravamudan is Professor of English and Dean of the Humanities at Duke University. He is the author of Tropicopolitans, Colonialism and Agency, 1688 to 1804, from Duke University Press, a book that won the Outstanding First Book Prize of the MLA in 2000. He's also published Guru English, South Asian Religion in a Cosmopolitan Language, which came out with Princeton in 2006, and Enlightenment Orientalism, Resisting the Rise of the Novel, published again in 2012 by the University of Chicago, and that's again the book that we'll mostly be thinking about this evening. And I want to particularly thank Srinivas, who changed his travel plans to get here in the calm before the storm tomorrow, so thanks so much for doing that. And then we have two discussants from Columbia. Stathis Gourgouris, who is the director of the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society, professor of English and Classics, and whose work, broadly defined, focuses on the poetics and politics of modernity. He's very interested in the question of secular criticism in the tradition of Said. Stathis is the author of Dream Nation, Enlightenment, Colonization, and the Institution of Modern Greece, which came out in 1996, and Does Literature Think? Literature as Theory for an Anti-Mythical Era, from 2003, and most recently from 2013, Lessons in Secular Criticism. Gauri Viswanathan is professor of English at Columbia, specialist of 19th century British and colonial studies, with a focus on questions of education, religion, and history of disciplines. She is the author of Masks of Conquest, Literary Study in British Rule in India, which came out in 1989, and Outside the Fold, Conversion, Modernity, and Belief, from 1998, which won the Harry Levin Prize of the ACLA and the James Russell Lowell Prize of the MLA, among other awards. And she has also edited Power, Politics, and Culture Interviews with Edward Said. So thank you to all the speakers for being here and for participating in this roundtable. Just to give a couple of points of departure for this evening's discussion before I hand over to them. So all of these scholars' recent work participates in a set of intersecting debates about the category and the practice of world literature, the question of secular criticism, and the question of how we think about Orientalism in periods before trans-Mediterranean colonization, the early modern Enlightenment. I started thinking about putting something together after reading Srinivas's book, Enlightenment Orientalism, Resisting the Rise of the Novel, and Siraj's essay, Notes from Babel, A Colonial History of Comparative Literature, which came out in Critical Inquiry a couple of years ago, and I think is the first articulation of this current book project. And I guess, probably like other people, including some of you, I felt that discussions about Orientalism and literature have reached a kind of impasse, where on the one hand, there's a perspective that retains the core insight of Said regarding the European production of the Orient as a discursive, the discursive arm of colonization. And on the other, a set of different perspectives, the most important, urgent of which I think is the perception that Said's argument doesn't give much of an account, or doesn't give much place for the possibility of reciprocal influence and exchange. Out of those different perspectives, I suppose, has emerged a little bit of thinking about early modern Orientalism in terms of, kind of good Orientalism and bad Orientalism, with an often rather unexamined chronology, and a focus on kind of philo-Orientalist biblical studies and this kind of question. So when I read Srinivas's book, I felt heartened because I thought it was kind of a breakthrough in its serious engagement with the heterogeneity of Orientalism in the early modern Enlightenment moments, and in its attempt to retain a number of tensions rather than simply evacuating them and choosing one side or the other. One of the central theses of the novel, and I'm sure you will speak about this this evening, is a questioning of a dominant narrative of literary history, which is that of the rise of the novel. So Srinivas has thought about the teleological assumptions of the narrative of the rise of the novel in England and France in particular, and what is at stake in according a central place to the novel. His book decenters that tradition by thinking a lot about the tale, by thinking about the tale as a site of Enlightenment Orientalism, so really bringing Orientalism into the possibility of enlightenment as he defines it. Srinivas's work also reopens the question of Orientalism from a different perspective, thinking about the Orientalist history of philology and history of the category of literature. He proposes a different history of comparative literature and world literature, one that is rooted particularly in colonial India and in the work of William Jones, who he locates as a key figure and perhaps following Michel Foucault, really a central figure in a paradigmatic shift in philology happening in the late 18th century. And ultimately, this rethinking of comparative literature leads him to question the enthusiasm for historical method and for textual history that we find in Said among other thinkers. There are some interesting commonalities in Srinivas and Siraj's projects, and also some differences in perspective, which I hope will come into the conversation this evening. So I'm going to invite them to speak first, and then ask Gauri and Stathis to offer their own perspectives. I don't think there could be two people better placed to comment on the various articulated and yet different aspects of these projects. So maybe, Srinivas, would you like to begin?
So, more than a decade ago, Terry Castle asserted that, quote, "The ball of 18th century novel studies has been definitively kicked through the goalposts," unquote. Yet when Ross Ballister published her study, Fabulous Orients, Fictions of the East in England, 1662 to 1785, which was in 2005, she legitimately claimed that there had been no book-length study of the Oriental tale in English for almost a century. The lacuna could be explained as the relationship between the Oriental tale and the novel was eschewed in Castle's list of the problems solved once and for all. but it is the wager of books such as Ballister's and mine that a reinvestigation of the various genres of 18th century prose fiction moves the goalposts of novel studies to different territory. The temporality of scholarship always forces new questions upon us. The questions before us today are not the same as those posed about the novel in the 19th century by Walter Scott, or even by Ian Watt in the 20th. I have three brief reflections to justify moving the proverbial goalposts. These happen to be critical markers as well as etymological prefixes to commence the discussion here. And if you'll indulge me, I use three pairs of post and trans concepts as rubrics. So the first brief remark is what I'm calling post-novelism and trans fiction. Novelism, as Clifford Siskin has named the overwhelming bias toward the genre as constitutive vehicle of modernity, has now receded with the emergence of powerful forms of narrative, such as feature film, interactive video games, and other new media. Are we at a post-novelistic moment from where we can look back at the history of the novel and much more broadly at the history of fictional genres with a new perspective? This was indeed true of Ballister's monograph's focus on, quote, narrative moves, as she calls it. We can look for counter-histories and sites of counter-memory, leveraging imputed loser genres against self-proclaimed winners, and reassessing forgotten receptions and ignored contextualizations. Ian Watt's teleology was by no means unproductive. It was a powerful theoretical machete that cleared a lot of the undergrowth, allowing for the erection of a spare English canon of Defoe, Richardson, and Fielding, capped by Jane Austen, that has since been criticized for its androcentrism and progressivism. The rise of the novel had great cross-field appeal beyond the minor local skirmishes amongst period scholars. If Watt's contribution was a misreading, it was a powerful and a consequential one that brought a lot of positive attention to a field, and most important, energized new generations of scholars who built several stories upon the platform he laid. Stories with an E. It brought history and theory together powerfully, as Michael McKeon has argued, even as it overemphasized, if you like, a British empiricist claim to the global trajectory of one national realist fiction writ large as universalist script. But in many respects, Watt also had powerful theoretical predecessors from the continental tradition who were staking their own claims about the novel as an engine of modernity. Gheorghe Lukács, Ortega y Gasset, and Mikhail Bakhtin. To slightly loosen the Anglocentric grip on this meta-narrative by switching from the effectivity of the novel to that of the Oriental tale as a parallel engine of modernity, and devoting equal attention to the French 18th century, as I have done, still leaves a bigger problem of Eurocentrism to confront that I have only partially addressed in my study. Structures once built cannot be dismantled entirely, and I should say that I don't have the expertise to talk about, other parts of the world because I'm not trained. I mean, I'm trained as a Europeanist and I know something about British and French literature, but I'm not, trained to talk about fiction in other parts of the world. So I plead my, partial training. My overall aim, nonetheless, was not to write a counter-history of the novel, but to stage multiple interrogations of the realist paradigm via intergenres, with the Oriental tale being my prime exhibit. Enlightenment Orientalism is an interruptive literary history that contests the exposition of British national realism and novelism with comparativist energies drawn from what is increasingly a post-novelistic moment. At the same time, just as much as Watt's ground clearing made short shrift of many writers, my emphasis veers away from national realism and toward non-novelistic prose genres promising transcultural access, and more about that in a minute. I've stayed close to the Oriental tale as intergenre, albeit within broader prose fiction contexts, even as I've not strayed into a full-scale exploration of drama, lyric, music, painting, furniture, gardening, and popular culture. And I just mentioned that because Orientalism tends to kind of take you everywhere, and I've not done that. I freely renounce any emergent partisanship toward the Oriental tale, especially now that the book is written and has sallied forth into the world. As Frederick Jameson has recently argued, realism has always been contrasted with a host of opponents: epic, romance, idealism, modernism, and now in my case, Oriental tale. And yet realism's tenacious continuation does make it a kind of useful straw man against which other genre epistemologies can cut their teeth. My study of the Oriental tale is itself a thought experiment, akin to many of the Orientalist fictions that I analyze. A provisional exercise in a universe of dynamic cultural interaction, rather than a finished statement about a singular reality. We have many overlapping language games being played in genre history, many microhistories and generic protocols to follow up, and several open-ended ideological frameworks still awaiting disentanglement and re-entanglement with neuroepistemologies and genealogies. So here's my second remark, and I'm indulgently titling it Post-orientalism, Transversality. Having faced dismissal by partisans of national realism and avant-gardists who use realist novels as the privileged vehicle for modernity narratives, the 18th century Oriental tale has suffered additional stigmatization since the powerful intervention made by Edward Said's Orientalism, which, I still acknowledge and accept is an absolutely path-breaking study, and it's created so much important dialogue and debate in its way. Saidianism, if you want to acknowledge there's such a thing, I don't know, spurred retroactive applications of anti-Orientalism as the ideological detoxification of genre history, and it had a signal influence. Orientalism, the book, urges vigilance about the nexus between power and knowledge, and yet a sometimes mechanical application of its conclusions to periods and genres that antedate the high imperial era has been problematic. If to resist the rise of the novel was a particular way of swimming against the current, opposing the generalized political and cultural interpretations of representations of Europe's eastern flank is altogether another endeavor. The fusion of two apparent opposites, Enlightenment and Orientalism, as Madeleine already mentioned, appealed to me as a powerful heuristic, an apparent oxymoron actually revealed as a secret alliance, leading, I hope, to eventual critical insight. While Ian Watt did not talk explicitly about the Enlightenment, the modernity narrative he promulgated took it largely as a given. genres apparently retarded from the perspective of modernity have ended up being doubly dismissed or relegated as suspect for containing negative stereotypes and inaccurate histories of, quote, the Orient. In this secondary rush to judgment, 19th century conventions, I believe, were yet again applied unconsciously or even explicitly to 18th century artifacts that were found wanting. The more I investigated the valence of Oriental tales, the more I discovered that Orientalism, at least 18th century Orientalism of a fictional nature, was a crucial part of the practice of Enlightenment disorientation. 18th century Oriental tales used, quote, the Orient as a movable rather than fixed target to unsettle the binaries of East and West, rather than to reinforce them. The Fontenellian structure of a plurality of worlds was extant, and I built upon that framework to demonstrate the flexible nature of these, quote, worlding, unquote, representations. These texts were recursive forms of pleasure, flexible forms of apprehension during a time when knowledge was still scanty and incomplete, and aspirations concerning elsewhere were highly uneven, when there was still significant work to be done to undermine political despotism within Europe using indirect forms of representation when censorship was the norm. Enlightenment and Orientalist fiction were allies, not adversaries. Oriental tales were indeed written in the 18th century alongside military and economic expansion, and featured competition and vulnerability in relation to the Islamic culture of the Mediterranean. However, the full-fledged bureaucracies of modern empires developed decades later, fixing these ventures into solidified definitions of specific areas, peoples, and cultures. For this reason, it might be worth considering the 18th century Oriental tale, at least in part, as pre- or pan-ideological, deployed by writers of varied political and intellectual persuasions. Rather than treat space as territory, these tales are about a utopic universal in which space is transversal. In a recent study published at the same time as mine, Humberto Garcia excavates a space for Islam as a radical supplement to the long 18th century, rather than letting it play the usual role of a religious archaism that Europe leaves behind in the quest for its singular and secular modernity. Garcia's objective of seeking to undo the binary oppositions between a progressive Enlightenment history of European literature and the Manichaean history of Asia as backward in relation to the narrative of progress matches my own. If Enlightenment Orientalism does it by putting aside progressive accounts of the novel in favor of a reappropriation of the Oriental tale, Garcia goes about it by critiquing arguments that use the teleology of Romanticism as a secularized replacement of Christian religious discourse. Said, as we know, followed the lead of M.H. Abrams' natural supernaturalism in this regard, and applied that model to Islamic culture as a victim, rather than also as hidden supplement and aspirational model. Post-orientalist vantage points, and of course this is in quotes, I know that Orientalism is alive and well, I'm not pretending that we're really beyond it, but I do think there's a vantage point that also is critical of it, so we have to keep both in mind. Post-orientalist vantage points allow us to see that Orientalism is neither static nor is it univocal, nor even always easily decoded in political terms. New theories of reading, once articulated, help us define a new theory of subjectivity in relation to a transversal cosmopolitan space. And here I find Siraj's work also really interesting because he both sees something in William Jones that's a possibility of something different, even at the same time as, of course, he takes very much the sense of Jones as inaugurating a colonial, sort of capture of space. I had already followed this track of the continuation of Orientalism by its objects in a very different light in the study that Madeleine mentioned, Guru English, South Asian religion and cosmopolitan language, where I do think it's important to take into account what I called in that study the self-orientalization by the colonized that allows a very, I think, compromised but nonetheless peculiar form of diasporic agency in colonial and post-colonial South Asian religious discourses. I mean, very famously, if I can just take a second, it's Partha Chatterjee's very insightful reading of Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, where the Macaulay view of the Bengali is that he lives in a vapor bath and sits under a tree and is lazy. And the Bengalis' rejoinder is that I was sitting under a tree and I was actually meditating, and I have this spiritual advance over Europe's technological modernity, and that spiritual advance gives me the different subject content that makes, if you like, a certain inaugural point for Indian nationalism as being something different. And I think that's a profound insight, because it's a way in which certain forms of South Asian religious discourse are really both taking Orientalism on, in accepting it and inhabiting it, and then using it as a kind of, rejoinder. Okay, my last remark, I know I've gone on long enough already. This one's called Postmodernism for Transculturation. Our current vantage point allows modernist as well as postmodernist methodological avenues for newer interpretation. Watt's take on realism was more modernist than realist, insofar as it took, quote, formal realism to be an aesthetic and epistemological vehicle, instead of asserting the formlessness of immediate reality and the unvarnished truth claims of individual testimony as the genre-bending novel writers of the 18th century proclaimed. In this context, the pleonasm of transculturation, as I do indeed use it in the study, is something to be explained. Indeed, the, quote, transcultural is rarely delivered as the content of any of these tales, that are indeed better delivering the, quote, third space of experimental innovation more than they are capable of delivering, if you like, the second space of the putative Orient, with the first space in this first, second, third ordinal kind of categories, the first space, of course, being that of national realism, which is the one that the Oriental tale actually rejects. Here, the self-conscious critique might be a reiteration of the symptom rather than a realist alternative to it. In my earlier study that Madeleine also very kindly mentioned, Tropicopolitans, I characterized one of the great Orientalist texts of the 18th century, Mary Wortley Montagu's Turkish Embassy Letters, as a form of what I called in that study Levantinization. Montague, who attempts to pass over into Ottoman high culture, ultimately returns to England with her own experience of that culture as a literary commodity. Using Victor Turner's anthropological application of William Van Camp's important understanding of transculturation, we can discern that an experience of liminality, which is perhaps the holy grail of genuine content-oriented transculturation, is reconverted into what Turner calls the liminoid, virtual transculturation rather than transculturation tout court. Hence, in relation to these tales, the transcultural indeed, quote, loses specificity, unquote. It didn't have it at all to begin with, so it doesn't even lose it, it just didn't have it. The Oriental tale, at least the 18th century Oriental tale, is ultimately a liminoid intergenre. And whatever transculturation it offers is a hybrid cosmopolitan vehicle anchored more in a refusal of the first space of Europe and oriented toward a third space that is yet to be articulated, but actually ends up being something like the second space. Or the third space, sorry, the second is supposedly so the third space is the hybrid, right, so the third space. To that degree, Orientalist representations of this fictional type are in danger of subsequently standing in as ersatz for the second space, even though that space was initially available more as fantasy than reality. And I think that's the real problem when people say, oh, here's so-and-so talking about Turks, and guess what, that's not what Turks were really like. It's like, yeah, I mean, isn't that obvious? I mean, that they didn't really know any Turks, so, you know, I mean, it's not a big discovery to say that, you know, to make that point. It's instead trying to figure out what was actually going on there, which is slightly different from accuracy. And when the charge always of inaccuracy is, I think, somewhat, it's an accurate charge, but it kind of misses the point because it's not about that. Of course, such tales can be seen as eliding a genuine anthropology and thwarting real access, whatever that means, to the other, whoever that may be. But that failure should not devalue the importance of these fictions. If anything, the standard move from these textual representations to actual histories of the areas that they supposedly represent poses the much greater danger of misrecognition, and from my point of view anyway, it involves the tedium of constantly, quote, correcting earlier distortion. It's a kind of activity that keeps a certain low-grade Saidianism of the mechanical type very busy. And I sort of wish we would move away from that because it's kind of not necessary to do, if you understand what this was about. The postmodernism of vantage point recognizes the difficulty of mimetic access both in the first space as well as in the third. To the degree we identify the postmodern as available vicariously avant la lettre in the metafictions of the 18th century, we undo the neat periodizations that blunt the performative effect of fictions on readers. Reading these texts in their original contexts alerts today's readers to the disorientations they were already capable of performing. These texts were powerful fantasies generating alternative realities, interrogating their times satirically, and opening themselves up toward partly determined futures. Literary history can never lose its temporal situation and cannot shake itself free of Nachtraglichkeit, the retroactive agency of deferred action. Postmodernism does not free us of the Enlightenment, but makes multiple temporalities collide, even as we are indeed drawn back within the Enlightenment complex. The reading subject is psychoanalytically regrounded, neither achieving pure identification with the past, nor breaking entirely free of it. In this way, the 18th century, read as an anticipation of the postmodern, is transcultural but also liminoid in the way that I was mentioning Victor Turner. The vacuity of liminoid experience connects with the weak power of literature rather than the direct appeal of politics, making available to us a gestural aesthetics that is subtle and indirect. This indeed typifies the transcultural universal of Enlightenment Orientalism.
An irony of the repeated calls, either for a return to philology, for example from Edward Said drawing on Paul de Man, or for a future philology, for example from Sheldon Pollock drawing on Nietzsche, is that philology has in fact never ceased being hegemonic in the humanities. Though the Romantic era philological revolution was critiqued from various quarters in the second half of the 20th century, its central premises still reign supreme. Every language undergoes historical change. All knowledge of the human domain must therefore be historical, and historical knowledge presupposes a historically specific understanding of the language under study. Disciplinary genealogies of literary studies, such as those written by Michael Warner, Gerald Graff, and John Guillory, argue that early 19th century German linguistics pioneered the new philology, which subsequently rose to scholarly hegemony in the late 19th century German and American Research University. But these accounts overlook the fact that late 18th century colonial scholars had already begun to reorganize Indian society on a philological model before the rise of historical linguistics and the research university. These scholars learned India's sacred languages, Persian, Arabic, and Sanskrit, decided which native religious manuscripts would become authoritative, translated, edited, and printed them, and made their precepts binding law. Tradition suddenly became text-based, standardized, philologically defined, and state-administered. The new philology acquired the global reach and authority it has subsequently enjoyed only because colonial rule reconstructed traditions around the world on a historical foundation. The invocation of philology as the humanities' necessary basis thus unwittingly rehearses a colonial script. Indeed, I would argue that the historical mission of philology reached fulfillment with the establishment of colonial law. I'll explain that comment in a few minutes. But if so, the study of colonial law should enable us not to continue extending the history of philology indefinitely, but to envision an antithetical approach instead. The prevailing view, expressed most prominently by Said, is that historical method is the essence of secular criticism, and by extension, an indispensable weapon in the struggle for human emancipation. According to Dissertot, though, it emerged originally within the walls of the early modern European state, and was expected to align the truth of the letter with the efficacy of power. In the colonies as well, historical method enabled a state to arrogate authority over tradition to itself. The East India Company proclaimed its legal codes to contain Islam's and Hinduism's historical truths. Yet religious authority had never been primarily textual in pre-colonial India. It had instead been embodied by clerics who constantly reinterpreted the tradition from within the fold of particular communities. Texts were primarily educational tools in the construction of the cleric's personal authority. Interpretations that no longer formed part of the written canon were said to survive in the cleric's memory, from where they could reemerge when the community needed them. In diametric opposition, the company used its codes to argue that clerical knowledge and social custom were historically corrupt. For company scholars, as for us, historical truth became synonymous with authentic texts. The problem with this symptomatically philological premise is that texts never correspond to history in any general sense. They are directly produced not by social collectivities, but rather by hegemonic classes. They are in fact, texts are in fact the joint legacies of the many elite orders that have succeeded each other in the transmission of tradition across history, long before the advent of colonial rule. Even in the most ancient civilizations, priest philologists claim the singular capacity to define the true meaning of the sacred language, which was always, according to Voloshinov, foreign and incomprehensible to the profane. The native legal manuscripts the colonial state codified were precisely the products of such philological power. In the very process of marginalizing the Brahmanic and Islamic clergy, colonial law thus inherited their legacy and disseminated many of their premises. Whenever we likewise take texts to represent history, we make ourselves one more link in an unbroken chain of philological power. At the inception of every new phase in the history of textuality, one form of philological power gave way to another. Colonial law merely took philology to its logical conclusion. It attempted to marginalize the social authority of all other language practices. So I think that's the sense in which, for me, colonial law is the fulfillment of the history of philology. Perhaps it is no coincidence, therefore, that the late 18th century colonial jurist who first codified both Islamic and Hindu law happens also, according to the scholarly consensus, to be a founding figure of the new philology. The work of Sir William Jones suggests that during the course of the late 18th century, historical method developed in conjunction with colonial rule across 3 distinct phases. So this is one of the primary points I want us to keep in mind. I think that the historicism we practice developed, if not within the matrix of colonial rule, at least alongside it in a necessary conjunction with it. The first phase, so 3 phases in the late 18th century. The first phase redefined the origins of language. This is long before colonial rule. The belief that each language possessed its own grammar, which could be known only by means of historical method, replaced the premise that every language was a variation on a single universal grammar, whose provenance was divine. Jones's wildly successful A Grammar of the Persian Language, 1771, was a seminal work within this transformation, though its intended purpose was to enable East India Company servants to appropriate the Mughal Empire's scribal, scholarly, and literary practices, and by extension, its forms of linguistic authority. The second phase led to the invention of national literary traditions. The historical approach to, this is Romantic nationalism, the historical approach to texts was thought to disclose a people's sovereign history and hence their national identity. In colonial India, this approach produced the codification first of Islamic and subsequently of Brahmanic legal traditions. The third phase engendered the idea of Indo-European civilization. It began with Jones's formulation of the Indo-European thesis, which posited, 1786, which posited that Latin, Greek, Persian, and Sanskrit had diverged from a common but historically unattested ancestral language. Inspired by Jones's subsequent translations of ancient Sanskrit legal and literary texts, European philologists would reconstruct the root words they believed had existed at the very dawn of civilization. These roots became the indispensable basis of the 19th century philological project to map human development in its historical totality. The first point to remember in regard to philology is, therefore, that its modern development is deeply entangled with the exigencies of colonial rule. The second point to remember is that the entanglement of philology and colonial law came to encompass or contaminate the romantic, or we could say modern, category of literature, and by extension, our concept of what constitutes a counter-hegemonic language practice. In fact, during each phase of late 18th century colonial philology, Jones produced a corresponding translation that would shape the concept of world literature, because he was fluent in these languages. So as he studied Persian, he did a Persian translation that was very influential, then Arabic, then Sanskrit. So in the first phase, A Grammar of the Persian Language contained a Persian song of Hafez. This is his translation of Hafez's famous ghazal called the Shirazi Turk, which would be widely read and influential among the Romantics. Jones presented Hafez's poetry as a model of aesthetic production founded on passion, according to Jones, the true source of the fine arts. His argument that the origins of poetic language lie not in the imitation of socially privileged forms of life, per Aristotelian and neoclassical aesthetics, but rather in the expression of desire in all of its diversity, helped found Romantic aesthetics. In the second phase, in the same year that Jones published his first codification of Sharia, he also translated the Mu'allaqat, the most influential collection of poems in the Arabic literary tradition. Bedouin poetry would remain the prototype long after the late 18th century of writing that opposed transcendent authority and constituted a different form of sovereignty. And then in the third phase, soon after formulating the Indo-European thesis, Jones translated the ancient Sanskrit drama commonly known as Shakuntala. The European philosophers and poets, from Herder to Goethe, who read Jones's translation declared almost universally that it brought them closer to humanity's original language than any other extant literary work. The romantic reading of Shakuntala prefigured the 19th century philological desire to reconstruct the language that precedes the historical record and to recover, by extension, the original form of man's inhabitation on the earth. The late 18th century emergence of the new philology occurred, therefore, in 3 phases, each of which was intimately tied to the exigencies of colonial rule and each of which has outlived the 18th century. First, European philologists historicized the origin of language. Second, they nationalized literary traditions. Third, they recovered the prehistorical roots of language. Each phase engendered a correspondingly long-lived fantasy. Philological methods would reconstruct the primordial languages of desire, the collectivity, that is the tribe first, and then any form of the nation. Languages of desire, the collectivity, and the earth, and thus give birth to new literary practices. With each successive phase, Jones's translations became the archetypes of an increasingly counter-hegemonic concept of literature. But the works Jones had translated were themselves, of course, each part of a hegemonic tradition. The historical function of these traditions was precisely to define desire's legitimate expression, the tribe's acceptable speech, and the earth's sacred discourse. Hence, in each case, the exclusion of alternative language practices, if not the destruction of other forms of life, constituted the tradition. Precisely when Hafez, the Mu'allakit, and Shakuntala presumed to speak for desire, the collectivity, and the earth, which they all do, they concealed their own constitutive exclusions. The new philology's attempt to locate counter-hegemonic languages within the literary tradition itself only reinforced this process of exclusion. The history of philology comprises endless series of such exclusions. If we acknowledge this history, which culminates in colonial law, as our inheritance, we could begin to think through its terms in order to arrive at a different method. A dialectical response to the history of philology would, it seems to me, entail 2 heterodox practices. First, it would search for those language practices that were not able or did not want to leave a mark on the historical record. Second, it would refuse to turn these language practices into objects of historical knowledge. In regard to the first point, the language practices that contest transcendent authority belong, by definition, to those who do not possess linguistic, textual, or philological authority and who do not pursue it. For a language practice to be truly counter-hegemonic, it cannot merely reject some given form of authority, it must resist authority as such, including, first of all, its own disposition to become socially authoritative. This is obviously not a premise that comparatists or post-colonialists are likely to accept, so get ready. We are programmed to value literary discourses that have enjoyed some measure of global success. Even the contemporary study of anti-colonial and radical literatures focuses inevitably on revolutionary parties, tricontinental congresses, aesthetic manifestos, and generic innovation. If we do not want to fall unwittingly into the trap colonial philology set for us, we will need to take a step back from all such attempts to define radical literature. This trap leads us to mistake forms of textual authority for counter-hegemonic language practices, as scholars such as Robert Young and Michael Denning do in the privilege they place on Marxist literature, or as Said did in his advocacy of philology. We would need instead to see in literature and philology themselves the effacement of counter-hegemonic language practices. So just in case this needs to be said, I'm not trying to dismiss the work of Robert Young or Michael Denning or Edward Said. What I'm trying to do is, in a sense, keep faith with what I think are the aspirations of their work that can't be realized to the extent we do not acknowledge the limits that philology has placed on their work. Okay. In regard to the second point, which is that we cannot turn a truly counter-hegemonic language practice into an object of historical knowledge. We cannot pretend, in the manner of colonial law and philology, to possess historical knowledge about language practices that never formed part of the historical record. The effort to reconstruct what philology has absented from the past obviously cannot appeal to the authority of philological protocols or historical method. It would operate instead by self-consciously constructing a link between that absent past and what remains under erasure in the present. This paradoxical effort to recognize forms of experience that were never recorded in the first place has the virtue, ironically, of keeping faith with the counter-hegemonic aspirations of the new philology. But apart from this, it also has a practical value. Those who lack linguistic authority, but nonetheless defend their own language practices in the face of such authority, cannot be incorporated into any polity. They point the way instead toward a still unthought form of social organization. Hence, the very effort to recognize their language practices, however impossible, would begin to emancipate us from the burden of philological power.
There's much that I agree with both my colleagues, and certainly I agree with the impetus in both cases. So my critical remarks are in some ways directed in certain details. Well, there's a large question that I want to ask Srinivas, but the first one that's more of a detailed question has to do with the way that you understand realism, or maybe I should put it this way, the way that you seem to discount realism's mutational capacity. It's kind of its ability, I think, to attach itself to various genres and modes of writing beyond what would be typically understood as realist narrative representation. This is something that is not a. This, I would say, is not geographically or not culturally specific. I would not say that this is some kind of tendency within the so-called Western canon. But it seems to be, it raises, for me, in any case, a big question as to what might be the epistemological integrity of realism. And therefore, if not reorients, which is kind of, we're going to end up with this problem using these metaphors, it certainly, I would not say reconfigures your argument, but it certainly problematizes it. I understand within the historical record, your genealogy and your argument is perfectly convincing. So it's not a question of inaccuracy. It's more, for me, a kind of philosophical question that's based on what I would argue is a historical realization. Realism, in a sense, is a construction. Really, I mean, what is to be understood to be realist in a specific epoch and language tradition is not realist to another, etc., etc. This is not to just be kind of some sort of stupid relativism about what is realist, but it is really to deal more than anything with its multiplicity or its mutational capacity, especially because it can kind of colonize, here we can use this term, various other modes. So, you know, magic realism becomes a huge industry of a certain kind of presumably realist writing, I mean by name, even though everybody doesn't think of it to be realist and so on and so forth. That may be a simplistic example, as the first I can come up with. The other thing is I understand very well, and I agree with your decision to stage the presumed opposition between Enlightenment and Orientalism as a complicity, and of course I agree entirely. What I would like to hear more, and this is something that you maybe you can elaborate with, is what might be the grounds of this complicity? Since it's very clear that you're not just assuming a very naive position of Enlightenment as just pure colonialism, I mean, which would not be, that would be, I think, not very nuanced way to think the Enlightenment, nor, I mean, if we are to be at all careful about our, you know, the Saidian way of reading text or method of thinking, we'd understand that these very large institutional formations are in fact always they have internal they're internally distended, and they are so they cannot be again oriented in one specific dimension. So I would like to hear more about this complicity. Let's say if the Oriental tale is a sort of utopian universal, would this be a mark of the complicity? Could we look there to find a mark of complicity? And the complicity there would be obviously addressable through the one aspect of the Enlightenment, which is a utopian one. Is the utopian aspect of the Enlightenment necessarily colonialist? This would be another interesting question. Necessarily, I can see where it is, but is it necessarily colonialist? And if not, then how might we see the Oriental tale as a utopian universal different? So the large question, which may not be fair, but Srinivas, you can tell me that it's not really. It is. I was trying to figure out the standpoint of your looking back. I mean, I understand very well the constructedness of what you've done. I mean, it's not, and I don't dispute it. It's actually a very it's a wonderful, both symmetrical and playful, and utterly has utter integrity in its terms. But it eludes me as the epistemological ground of it eludes me, particularly since there is a kind of looking back component which does presuppose, even though you said it's not the case, a stepping out or a post point. Okay, I mean, I'm all in very sympathetic to your argument that the post point is entirely constructed, but then this raises the question about this ground. This I understand is very large and may be unfair. Well, I was going to actually quote some stuff from you, but maybe I won't. We can see if we can discuss this maybe later. But Siraj, I mean, I'm extremely sympathetic to the political impetus here, particularly in light of my own work on radical democracy and what that entails. This concerns me a great deal. I have some questions. I have some questions of two. I think it's on two grounds, two main axes. I think one is the issue of the kind of power you give to the historical method, and then the kind of privilege you give, again, power maybe would be the better word, to textuality. I think that, okay, yes, there's no doubt about the fact, you're correct, that philology is utterly dependent on historical impetus, and I think it's very insightful to say that in its relation to the colonialist process, that colonial law may in fact be a kind of endpoint or a kind of product of philology. I think it's very, very interesting. I agree with that. It's definitely a very interesting idea. The question, though, would be for me to reverse it and say, is the historical method necessarily philological? I mean, I understand that philology, when we are in the ground of philology, then we can see both the historical impetus, the historical method, the institutional drive of a certain production of historical knowledge of self and other and all that. That's obvious. But But is, you know, the historical method necessarily philological? I mean, this is important because I think when you are in some ways trying to argue for an alternative, well, if not for an alternative history, and this is a question here, you are trying to articulate an alternative politics, certainly, and not just that, but also an alternative way of articulation, you know, an articulation of people who have been excluded. So this, since I respect and I'm very much on the side, I want to tease this further. It seems to me that in that sense, the argument that textuality as a lead power, you know, as a lead power, sort of too poor, is I think a little one-sided of an argument. I mean, it's argument that has been made, you know, concerning all kinds of societies, certainly archaic societies, and so on and so forth. But that, you know, makes it sound as if orality, which would be the other side. I mean, just conventionally speaking, you don't say that, but conventionally speaking, that would be equivalent to some kind of counter power, counter lead. Now, obviously, I don't think that you would agree with that. So it's not enough it's not enough, it seems to me, to isolate textuality as a lead power. And I would go further. To say, I mean, for example, since you bring up, in fact, the word radical democracy exists somewhere in this text, right?
I changed it because I realized that was your term and I didn't want to
Okay, well, that's interesting. Well, I did see it. Oh, that's interesting. Then we'll have a lot more to talk about. But you know, an example that may seem to be out of left field because it's not within the colonial paradigm, but it's very interesting because it is an archaic culture. Is the case of Solon in Athens, you know, putting down in writing the first legal texts, and there was a specific reason to do so. It was in order to counteract the non-textual power of elites which did not have to have laws written down and therefore not held accountable. The whole point of writing writing laws down and making them public was so that the polity could see that they were its own laws and therefore they could be erased and rewritten. So I mean and I'm sure that we can find other such examples. This I think is an issue that you would have to kind of bring into your argument. And then there is a tendency in the end of the text, at least the one that I have here, to make an argument that the counter. I really love the argument, the language practices that resist transcendent power. Those are the language practices that I'm interested in as well. I'm not so sure that these practices can be somehow exempted from producing or practicing historical knowledge. I'm not sure how that would be done. Or, I mean, you say at one point we cannot turn counter-hegemonic practices into historical knowledge. Okay, well, big question mark here is who is we, right? I mean, maybe, okay, elite intellectuals, that could be seen as an appropriation. That was something you read, it's not a text exactly. But really, if that's something that we would agree with, no problem. The thing that's more difficult is to talk about how these counter-hegemonic practices, many of which may not find themselves in textualities that are easily available or well established, how are they producing historical knowledge? Because they are producing historical knowledge for those people who are conducting the counter-hegemony. I mean, that's not outside of history. I mean, unless we, obviously make it some kind of metaphysical thing, which you don't want to do since you say resist transcendent power. So this is really, for me, I think the kind of crucial nodal point of the argument.
I very much enjoyed reading the new work about Srinivas and Siraj. They offer sophisticated readings of a wide range of 18th century texts in an effort to show that Enlightenment Orientalism was not so much anchored in colonialism as in a transcultural literary project that, as Srinivas demonstrates, privileged tales of imagination as precursors of the novel form, and in Siraj's work implicates contemporary literary studies in Enlightenment philological practices. Both speakers importantly ask us to reconsider how we might begin integrating East-West narratives into a broader literary history of the world. Indeed, Srinivas's interest is in providing an alternative genealogy of the rise of the novel that dislodges domestic realism in favor of the Oriental tale as the principle that drives the novel form. Now, in bringing the fabulous into the history of the novel, indeed, identifying the fabulous as generative of the novel form, Srinivas in Enlightenment Orientalism prompts me to push my own thinking about ways to approach narratives that, I was very happy to hear Siraj talk about narratives that precede recorded history, inhabit deep time, and are therefore deemed to be lost, as Sumati Ramaswamy notes in her provocative book, The Lost Land of Lemuria. In the article that Srinivas said, so I found there's actually a point of contact between this recent work of both Srinivas and Siraj, which really intersect with some of my own current interests. In the article that Srinivas had sent us, East-West Literature as World Literature, which was just published in 18th Century Studies, right? Srinivas comments on Simon Oakley's English translation of the Arabic work, The Improvement of Human Reason, exhibited in the life of Hai Ibn Yokdan, a 1708 publication. The work concerns the unaided human capacity to attain knowledge about natural things. The throwaway line for me is Srinivas's brief mention of Atlantis, when he asks, and I quote from Srinivas, "But is it futile to identify a first mention of the mythical power of the deserted island as a site of philosophical reflection when this goes back to Plato's Atlantis?" Now, this observation reinforces the conundrum that past civilizations reputed to be advanced, like those of Atlantis and Lemuria, preceded recorded history and existed outside the framework of biblical chronologies. The attempt to reconcile biblical chronologies with non-biblical ones problematized notions of time, history, and agency, and I think this is coming out very much in Siraj's new project as well. How do we assess the unaided human capacity for understanding of natural things as wisdom or knowledge? And I just taught this class with my seminar here, where Walter Mignolo begins to address this question when he writes almost elliptically, and I quote, "In enchanted places, wisdom and not epistemology was first non-Christian." So there's this binary that's already established around this problem of unrecorded history or language, or I think as Siraj had put it, a language that precedes the historical record. So when we talk about this binary between wisdom and epistemology, it evokes precisely the problem that is evoked by Siraj when he refers to languages that precede recorded history. In Europe's Enlightenment narrative, ancient wisdom, which is the problematic concept here, ancient wisdom was both an oxymoron and the opposing concept against which the Enlightenment narrative defined itself. The incompatibility of antiquity with modern scientific ways of knowing so thoroughly underwrites this narrative that when Paolo Rossi, in The Dark Abyss of Time, provocatively reminds us that ancient wisdom has long been a site of contest, his questioning underscores the unstable ground on which the hegemony of Enlightenment narrative was forged. And so I would like to step into the provocative conversations Srinivas and Siraj have opened up for us by invoking Rossi's important work as a helpful reference point for rethinking the Enlightenment narratives that position antiquity and modernity, wisdom and epistemology as binary opposites. Among the historical examples Rossi cites is the divergence between Vico and Bougainville on the idea of the pagan. Setting up a systematic connection between the acceptance of the idea of occult wisdom and the denial of providence, Vico maintained that to attribute civility and culture to the founding principles of pagan, that is pre-Christian or non-Christian nations, and to conceive of ancient peoples as having wisdom, dispensed with the notion of teleological godly design. Vico considered Plato's elevation of so-called barbaric peoples to divine and recondite knowledge, especially pernicious, going on to say that the idea of pagan peoples as possessors of recondite wisdom blinded Plato from seeing that they were merely consumed by wonder and ferocity. For Vico, the conviction that there was wisdom even at the origins of society was to assume that natural law and natural morality ruled even the pagan nations. In sum, to subscribe to this idea of ancient wisdom is to put natural law and natural morality in the place of God. As we all know, Vico was an important intellectual influence on Edward Said, who pays homage to Vico as a proto-secularist in his unwavering commitment to human action and knowledge as the motor of human history. In his essay on repetition, Said writes, "What human beings do is what makes them human beings. What they know is what they have done." Yet, as Said also notes in the same essay, Vico subscribed to a theory of cycles that had shades of Plato, but which traced human development from pure bestiality to moderate rationality to over-refined intellectuality to new barbarism and to a new beginning again. And this is a quote from Said. At the heart of Vico's argument was the view that human society had an irrational and fantastic origin in the shape of giants devoid of reason and possessed of vigorous imagination. And this is where we enter the terrain of the Oriental tale. Vico doubted whether Hebraic philosophical thought could have ever learned its sublime theology from the Egyptians, who by creating deities with their imaginations qualified as founders of false religions. The notion that the time preceding sacred time was not real time, but only an imagined, fabulous time, led necessarily for Vico to the thesis about the primitive barbarity of nations. For Vico, there were only two hypotheses that could explain the origin of the pagan nations. Either they were born of the conscious reflection of learned men, or else from a human instinct, buried in some beast-like men. In the new science, he contrasted the idea of a highly developed philosophy hidden within hieroglyphics to an image of Egypt closed to the world, held hostage by barbarous superstition. Vico's vision thus attributed roughness and barbarity to the peoples who had been seen to have had a wisdom that existed before Hebraic civil society, or that in some way rivaled Hebraic wisdom. There was no way that the history of the Egyptians could be integrated to Judeo-Christian civilization without breaking apart the very foundations of Judeo-Christian epistemology. The challenge for historians of modern civilization was to account for the possibility that Judeo-Christian culture might indeed have derived or at least borrowed features from past pagan cultures. Could the roots of civilization really lie in the cultures of the so-called barbarians? Were the barbarians, in fact, highly advanced people who laid the foundations for a rational technological culture? Now, Paolo Rossi deals with these very difficult questions and finds some attempt to get answers in the work of Nicolas Freire, in whom he finds the first major effort to break the hold of Western epistemology on constructions of non-Western and non-Christian systems of thought, which he dates roughly around 1750. Freire took his stand in conscious opposition to the methods of study and interpretations of scholars of the preceding century. As the conflict of ideas between Vico and Freire demonstrates, the real challenge was to find a critical position to consider all past human history. Rossi cites Nicolas Freire as one among a handful of thinkers working for the full integration of Egyptian and Chinese history within the general history of mankind. It was said of Freire that, quote, without prejudice, without preconceived plan, he carefully gathered citations, passages, vestiges of traditions, in a word, all the fragments of the annals of the world scattered in ancient authors. He separated them from later glosses, weighed these different testimonies, and in comparing one to the other, he had the pleasure of finding an agreement among them, by which he himself was astonished. The interesting description here, in my view, is that Freire separated the citations from later glosses in his search for traces of ancient wisdom that had not become part of an archive of commentary. And this is where I think all of us are sort of coming together. Stathis talking about seminal and sort of the non-textual as a possible challenge to authority. And for me, the particular project that is going on in the mid-18th century, in a figure like Nicolas Freire, was particularly important to a figure that I have been thinking and writing about for some time, and this really touches on your Guru English, Srinivas. And this is the Russian occultist, Helena Petrovna Blavatsky. And among her her works, one of the ones that I just want to talk about very briefly in my concluding remarks, which really sort of crystallizes a lot of the points that have come up this evening, is her attempt to substitute archaeology for philology as the means by which the origins of religions can be established. And she writes in one of her works, A Land of Mystery, and I quote, "If the history of religion and of mythology, and far more important, the origin, developing, and final grouping of the human species are ever to be unraveled, we have to trust to archaeological research rather than to the hypothetical deductions of philology." Blavatsky reorients the basis of historical research away from philology, which had succeeded, as we had just heard, in defining older civilizations as merely undeveloped primitive prototypes of the Judeo-Christian civilization. Instead, Blavatsky salvages the ruins of civilizations destroyed by imperial conquest, of submerged continents like Atlantis, which were lost to history. Unlike ancient languages, which can be deciphered by searching for a common origin that then becomes the key to reading other languages, ruins, suggests Blavatsky, resist the best efforts of cryptographers. Ruins become for her the open, visible sites of gaps in historical memory, gaps that resist interpretive closure. Her search then is for the gaps in history that, when revealed, produce another order of understanding that she names ethical knowledge. Her archaeological method closely resembled Freire's method of gathering citations and passages in ancient authors, and then separating the citations from later glosses, as well as the fragments from later reconstructions. In fact, this is exactly what she does in her, what I think is her greatest work, which is Isis Unveiled, which is really her effort to rewrite the history of religions. Her effort, quite simply, was to break the archive free from the hold of interpretive communities.
Srinivas and Siraj, opportunity to respond a little bit to what has just been said, and then we'll...
Sure. I'll try and be brief, and I'm sure Siraj will be as well, because we probably want to go to the audience. I just want to mark, thank you both, Stathis and Gauri, and Siraj for your great remarks. So I'll just respond very, very quickly, just to at least, acknowledge and say something in response to the points in broad. Stathis brought up the question of the mutational capacity of realism, and I totally think that's a really important point to bring up. To the degree that I was working off something as a straw man, it wasn't even realism as such, but what I named national realism, which is a particular form that Ian Watt, English domestic realism. And often I find that the Oriental tale isn't simply pure fantasy. I mean, it can be in some instances, but a lot of the time it's trying to mobilize some kind of alternative realism, right? However well-grounded that is or not. But it can take the form of Fontenelle thinking of unfamiliar realism rather than familiar realism in cosmological kinds of versions. We think of another planet, but actually think of scientific possibilities. And sci-fi nowadays is sometimes a version of that, right? Kind of unfamiliar realism. Or another instance which I looked at a little bit in the book was Francis Sheridan's very, very interesting tale, The History of Nur Jahad, that uses a theatrical kind of metaphor of extending time and plays this huge kind of confidence trick on a character who then, there's a whole unveiling at the end that brings him crashingly back into reality. But the point is to show, how when you kind of run a certain kind of thought experiment and people inhabiting different times can then suddenly find a collision. So I think in many ways the whole point about the mutational capacity of realism is something, at least in certain Oriental tales, I think this is Stuart Montesquieu's Lettre Persane as well, it's trying to kind of bring those into some kind of crisis. So I totally think that the philosophical question there is a really important one, that at least in the best forms of Oriental tales does get some play. The question of the grounds of complicity between Enlightenment and Orientalism, again, I totally think that that's an important one, and I agree with you that, at least to me, the Enlightenment is not necessarily colonial. I mean, of course, it can be, as we know, but the whole point, I think, with the Oriental tale of the 18th century was that it was in many ways exploring both the relativist end of things as well as the universalistic end, and then trying to bring them both to crisis again in relation to each other. So in this respect, it's not so much, if I can be crude about this, an ethno-cultural version of saying these people are like that, and that's, the 19th century version, if I can use that very broadly as a contrast. I think a lot of what was happening in 18th century Orientalism was to play both ends against the middle. And so you have a kind of radical universalism to think that everybody's alike and has certain common emotions, dispositions, certain ways of reacting to a social context. And then also thinking that there are epistemes, there are religious beliefs that make people, quote, different from each other and radically different from each other. And so these are obviously contradictory positions, but I think the Oriental tale was invested in both sets of propositions, but then trying to force some way of, like I said, using both ends against the middle. So in that respect, I think that's where Enlightenment and Orientalism come together in that oxymoronic way in the title. And then the large question, well, I think it's a fair question. I don't think it's an unfair question about whether, the past is, looking back, well, I sort of think we do have access to both positions. I think it's precisely because of the point that I made earlier about self-orientalization. I think there's more awareness and choice, and of course there's Orientalism is still very powerful, as we know, the Iraq War, all kinds of things. But there's a way in which there is a critical discourse that lives outside of it and says, look, this is crazy, this is not the way to imagine what people are like. And then, there are powerful discourses that exist to take it over. But I do think we have access to kind of at least some sort of post-orientalist standpoint, it's not pure, it's not achieved. We always have to fight for it, but it's not simply just fantasized either. There is a possibility of something else. So, okay, let me go to Gauri, and I know Siraj has to comment as well. I have comments for you as well, but I'll leave that to later, because, I do have great interest in what you're doing. So, thank you, Gauri, for your comment. And I think the first point is, I love the way you went to the Paolo Rossi point, because in some ways the whole notion of enlightenment, at least in the medieval Gnostic tradition, is associated with the idea of wisdom. It's kind of, at least there's whether it's connected with Egypt or something else, even with the text that you mentioned that I'm fascinated with, that I talked about in the article that I circulated, the notion of Arab learning that comes again from the medieval context. There is a sense of enlightenment as wisdom, and then of course you have this way in which in the origin wisdom and science seem to be placed together, and then you have the Enlightenment reorganization of that, where science becomes true, if you like, and then you have magic, and then you have ideology. So you have, or false, or crazy ideas that people have that are not true, falsity. So in a sense, wisdom, is this complex thing that seems to come from somewhere else, but that has an impact. And in the Renaissance too, there's this kind of, if you like, demystification of wisdom into science and magic. And you see this happening at different moments in the Enlightenment. I don't think I can say enough about it now because I'd love to move on, but I think that there is an interesting crossover from the notion of the wisdom of the East, and often, of course, it's coming from there, that then is somehow displaced by the idea of science that's from the West. And this is again taken up, like I said, even with the Chatterjee example of Bankim, this kind of spiritual wisdom of the East, and so on and so forth. But enlightenment, when Kant uses the term, it's really interesting that it's a metaphor of light, and it goes back to Gnosticism. It's there even in the frontispiece that I was using from Khalid bin Yaksan. Okay, so just one more point, and I'll turn over to Siraj. This whole issue of it's linked to the several of the examples you propose: Atlantis, the lost land of Lemuria, the Vico example. It seems to come back into that complex. And I thought this move in Blavatsky to archaeology away from philology is a really fascinating one that goes counter to what is the broader 19th century move to language and history that Siraj talks about. So maybe we need to think about that more, but in the interest of giving everyone a chance, I'll pass on to Siraj. Yeah.
Transition.
Yeah, thank you.
I think we're already over time, so actually I'm not going to use this. I think we're already over time, so I'll try to be as quick as possible. I'm really, really grateful for the engagement. You spend a year or two working on a book alone in your study. No one hears it besides your partner. It doesn't really make sense to her. It's not clear it makes sense to you anymore. And so it's really wonderful when you're making a particularly polemical argument to have a sympathetic response. It really means everything, and I appreciate the questions also. I have the answers here, and they're perfect answers. Unfortunately, I don't have the questions anymore, so I'm not sure if it'll make sense. But I think Stathis' first question was, is historical method necessarily philological? And I think there's a way in which that question comes back in the third question Stathis asked, which is really, what's wrong with historical knowledge? Really, is all historical knowledge bad? Is it necessarily bad? No, absolutely not. I mean, this book is called Archaeology of Babel, and so archaeology is a form of historical research that depends upon historical knowledge, but is not concerned actually to produce knowledge as its end goal, but in fact wants to understand what the preconditions of any truth regime or knowledge formation at any given time is. So that's what I'm trying to do as an opening gambit, not philology, but archaeology, not in Blavatsky's sense, but in Foucault and Nietzsche's sense, as a beginning. That is, you do historical research in order to understand what the premises are of historical knowledge at any given moment in time, based upon the idea that historical knowledge, when it's institutionalized, is a form of authority that has to be rethought. Okay, so is historical method necessarily philological? Go back to that question again. If we're speaking about literary scholars, historicism tends to be philological in the sense that it depends upon written records, and it assumes that those written records are adequate representations of a people or a period. That, I think, was the opening step of philology. It seems to me, to a great extent, still with us. Okay, that's the first one. The second question was, is textuality so bad? And Stathis came up with the example of Solon, who used writing effectively to put limits on power, and Stathis says there must be other examples of this, and I think the Hebrew commandments are another perspective. The commandments are a way to put limits on mythic violence, that's the idea. So textuality at the moment—
But they're not, sorry to interrupt, they're not the text of the people.
Yeah, okay, well that's maybe part of the issue. So, you know, at any given moment, a text that is written can be a fundamental form of counterpower. Anyone can write a text from a position of dispossession against power. But for that text to be transmitted across time, it has to move through the hands of power, I think. There's no way, I think, for a text to be transmitted across time always in the hands of the dispossessed. There's no way for that original idea to remain. It will be reinterpreted, it'll be reinterpreted from a perspective of power. So I think textuality is a problem, but I was not locating textuality as the problem. So I have this clumsy formulation perhaps of, when I say it, I say linguistic authority, textual authority, philological authority. It's really three different stages of power. I mean, there's no doubt infinite stages of philological power, but the first one is not textual, it's oral, I assume. So for instance, the Vedic mantras are not first written texts, they're oral texts. And before the rise of colonial philology, as I said, philological authority tends to be personal, not textual. So the Brahmin priest or the Islamic Malvi are forms, they might have text, but their authority does not derive from text, it is theirs, it is their charisma, it is their training. So I'm not, unlike people like Jack Goody, I'm not counterposing orality to textuality. That's precisely the kind of thing I want to avoid, where the stage before becomes what is counter-hegemonic and therefore privileged. I think the point is we're critiquing, as we should be, colonial philology or academic knowledge. And so what we then want to do is reconstruct what comes before as something that has the possibility of counter-hegemony. The trouble is that what comes before for us is itself a textual inscription that is going to be marked by power, and we have to keep on seeing that eternally. So that's why I don't think that I'm counterposing. I don't think I'm privileging textuality, and I don't think I'm presupposing that what comes before textuality is a form of counterpower. Okay, and the last point was, don't those who are unable to leave a mark on the historical record, don't they also possess historical knowledge? And so this goes back to the first answer. They might, they very well might, but they don't have the power to impose their historical knowledge on anyone else. So that's not the historical knowledge I'm trying to critique. I'm trying to critique the formation that has grown from colonial philology and the new philology, and I think still marks academic knowledge. So the point isn't to think historically, that's not the issue. The issue is that historical knowledge had a certain valence because it was able to be imposed from centralized institutions, the colonial state, the European state, and now the university. And so and that's the power of it. That's to say, it knows the other from a centralized place. And so that's the form of historical knowledge that we are all trapped in, because we have to produce knowledge. It's the basis of our own authority. But we have to understand that that knowledge and authority began as a form of governance, and I think still is, in a way.